It is a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce our presidential speaker, Renée DiResta. She's the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is a cross-disciplinary program of research, teaching, and policy engagement for the study of abuse in current information technology. I think that's what a concept, abuse in information technologies. Renée investigates the spread of malign narratives, another great concept, malign narratives, across social and media networks. Her work examines the ways in which distinct types of actors leverage the information ecosystem to exert influence, from local activists promoting health misinformation and conspiracy theories to the well-resourced full-spectrum information operation by state-sponsored actors. Daniel and I always do some pre-conversations with the people who are going to give this talk, and I can't tell you how much I've already learned from Renée and how much I am looking forward to the talk she's about to give. So Renée, let me give you the podium.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today. I am really excited. I was listening to the sessions this morning, and I think that there's a lot of shared understanding, common understanding, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we did at SIO throughout 2021. So we are not a health misinformation-focused institution. We actually look at how narratives spread far more broadly. A lot of our work is actually on election integrity and things like this. And I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of where these kind of areas intersect, and then to kind of go through some of the findings that we saw as we were looking at COVID specifically throughout 2021. So I myself actually found myself entering this career in large part because I was a parent activist in 2015 following the Disneyland measles outbreak. There was a law that we passed in California called SB 277, and it was a law that eliminated personal belief exemptions. At the time, I had a totally different career. I had a supply chain logistics startup. I was in tech, and I was a mom. I had a son who was 1 year old, and I had to get him onto preschool lists. And so as a person with kind of a data science inclination, I pulled down about 10 years of California Department of Public Health data, looked at trajectory and trends over time, found it horrifying, actually called my representative and was like, why are there preschools with 35% uptake in MMR? This is absolutely insane. And so again, I was just an angry mom. The Disneyland measles outbreak happened 2 months later. I called again and I said, come on, surely now there is appetite, never waste an epidemic. And they said, Dr. Pan in Sacramento is going to be initiating some legislation. We need highly visible parents to speak in favor of vaccines. That currently doesn't really seem to exist. And so myself and a few other moms who also happened to call were connected by Dr. Pan's office, and we started a group called Vaccinate California. And my role in Vaccinate California was actually to do a lot of the data analysis and to go to the legislators in both the Senate and the Assembly in California and to say, this is what we see in your district, these are your trends over time, this is our understanding of immunization rates in your community. California Medical Association was very involved. I know there's a few folks from there here today. But what I started doing was actually mapping the Twitter conversation, because one of the things that we were trying to do at Vaccinate California was to grow a highly visible parental counter movement. The anti-vaccine movement had been quite adept at networking on social media for quite some time, beginning back in 2009, then 2011, National Vaccine Information Center had begun establishing pages. By that point, we had a number of significant anti-vaccine groups with large followings. That really pivoted as the bill was announced into stop mandatory vaccination and the conversation around vaccine mandates. So what I did in my analysis was I worked with a data scientist named Gilad Lotan, who actually, funny enough, is a Colorado resident who I was with yesterday. And we were mapping the Twitter conversation, and this is a network graph of the vaccine conversation on Twitter, the hashtag SB277 in particular. The orange cluster down there, if you're not familiar with how these graphs work, they are colored according to kind of topical homogeneity, what the members of a community are talking about. And so in this particular graph, orange is the autism community. Pink is the anti-vaccine community. Again, for a very, very long time prior to 2015, this community really focused on health-specific anecdotes, not liberty at all. But what we started to see was the emergence of the blue cluster at the top, which was the medical freedom cluster. Now, I think most of you are quite familiar with that term. You've heard it. It's quite prevalent in the COVID conversation. But it really began to emerge on Twitter as a highly visible, distinctive entity as anti-vaccine activists who had been quite present in the conversation for a long time with disproven health claims, with actual misinformation about vaccines causing autism, pivoted to talking instead about liberty, because that performed better with the legislators in the political fight that was happening in California. The large kind of teal stripe there is the Tea Party. So why is the Tea Party present in the conversation? Because as the conversation pivoted to liberty, all of a sudden, instead of it remaining focused in what had previously been primarily the wellness and kind of what we called the kind of crunchy California moms was our, terminology for it, they really began to reach out quite directly on Twitter to the Tea Party, very deliberately kind of posting hashtag SB277 into prominent Tea Party hashtags to try to call attention to that highly activist community, we sometimes call them factions, to try to get them to pay attention to the vaccine conversation as well. The last cluster over there in green, so one of the things, when you look at a network graph like this, the size of the circle often indicates the prominence of the node, the centrality of the node to the conversation. So those are accounts that have a lot of followers. They are very good at making things go viral. They're good at getting things trending, perhaps. They are influential within their community. Again, the ties between them are who is talking to whom in this particular graph. And so each of these circles is a Twitter account. So the green cluster over there was the public health community. And it was, you'll notice, it's quite outside of the conversation. It is not really talking to the participants in the conversation, who are, again, there is no just sort of pro-vaccine contingent as far as like parents. This was, of course, what Vaccinate California was trying to set out to do, which was why I was running Twitter accounts and doing these network maps. Again, you can understand the structural dynamics of how information moves across a network. Network science applies in so many different disciplines, and it's highly useful as more and more people get their information on social media. But the takeaway from this was really that the public health officials were having a totally different conversation. And they did not have the same influence, and they did not have the same degree of participation within the actual conversation that was happening. So this was troubling. So I'm going to talk about where things have gone since then. So the first point I want to make in this talk is that anti-vaccine narratives are very, very old. You can read British Medical Journal. The letters to the editor are all digitized, and if you go back to the 1800s, you will read anti-vaxxer in comments in the form of letters to the editor about smallpox variolation. But the way that they spread has changed. Second point I want to make is that the change is co-occurring alongside social shifts, including a decline in trust, which ties directly into what we were hearing about this morning. And the third point is that these dynamics now require a different type of response, because we are not going back to the old way. We are not restoring that trust in the immediate next week. And so as we work through that process of reestablishing trustworthiness, it is also time to adapt to the way that the information moves, particularly to the network dynamics that happen on social media, where more and more people spend their time and engage with community. Again, those clusters of accounts talk to each other constantly. And so this is where the conversation is happening. This is where we call it kind of collective sense-making is happening. So I want to differentiate between three things that pop up in the media coverage of this topic quite often. The first is misinformation. Now, it's my feeling, after looking at this stuff for about 7 years, and again, as in the intro, I've done a bunch of work on the Russia investigation, election misinformation, health misinformation, political, climate, you name it. Again, because we can do network analysis independent of topic. The structure of how network moves, how information moves, is separate from the substance that is moving. Misinformation has had a bit of a scope creep problem. It is often used and is very politicized now in the same way that fake news became politicized to mean things that I don't like or don't agree with. What it should mean in its most rigorous form is information that is demonstrably false, information that is actually falsifiable. There is a claim that is presented and there is a scientific consensus or some sort of refutation of that point. It is not a matter of opinion, there is an actual fact. Disinformation, when we talk about that, it's much more heavily entrenched with propaganda. It is often not actually false. It is often something that is information that is highly inflected. It is put out with a particular spin. It is often not falsifiable at all. It usually functions in the context of a campaign, not one particular piece of content, but trying to create a perception that many, many people believe a particular thing. Misinformation is accidental. Disinformation is done quite deliberately and very much on purpose. And that's one of these, again, when people use disinformation to describe people who are wrong on the internet, that really kind of leads to some problems when we talk about how, for example, the US government should respond to disinformation campaigns, which oftentimes have a non-domestic component. And then the third that I want to talk about here is actually viral rumors. And I heard a few people use the word rumor this morning. And as we talk about what is happening, rumors are information that spreads in a peer-to-peer capacity through unofficial channels. That's kind of the academic definition. And the interesting thing about that notion of unofficial channels is that these are not, the elite or the state or the arbiters of truth have not sanctioned this information. This actually makes it quite appealing in low trust environments. They are not telling you the truth. We are talking about the truth in our community. And the challenge of rumors is that sometimes they turn out to be true. And this is one of the dynamics that's challenging when we contextualize our information as misinformation before we have actually had time for that consensus process to happen. So a lot of the debates about how social media should respond, how companies should respond, what should be labeled, what should be taken down, how things should be addressed, are operating under misinformation policies, many of which on the social media platforms were developed around vaccines like MMR in the health, in the vaccine conversation specifically, where there is a lot of very long established fact. Whereas what was happening in COVID was that the facts hadn't been established. You saw this perhaps most prominently in the mask conversations early on, where institutional entities were not really participating or were, seemed a little bit cagey. And so there was a lot of debate on social media about whether, the kind of ordinary people who were seen as skeptics or contrarians were arguing in favor of masks a lot earlier than institutions. People began to notice that rumors about the origin of COVID were also quite prominent in this space. The lab leak hypothesis was immediately contextualized as a conspiracy theory and misinformation and aggressively moderated and taken down. When new findings, and again, I think as of last week we were back to the wet market, but this is the dynamic, right? How do you contextualize information? How do you give people the best information? How can you curate and surface information when there is no consensus? And I think that is actually the central tension that is kind of plaguing the information environment at this time. So when we talk about the structure of social media, independent of the specific substance that is moving along it, one of the things that we, when we kind of contextualize significant shifts in the information environment, the first is zero-cost publishing, which is that anyone can put out information at any time. The second is audience consolidation, which is many, many people on a handful of platforms all talking to each other and getting information from each other. Algorithmic curation, again, what does a social media company surface in response to the query, what is the origination of COVID? What does a social media company push to people when they're surfacing trending content? There are value judgments in here. There are also unintended consequences of algorithms that tend to reward popularity. But the core question of, in an information glut, what do you surface, is actually the sort of central systemic tension underlying a lot of these conversations. Personalized targeting, how do people find their information, and how can bad actors, as we saw, for example, in the California SB 277 debate, people were running ads on Facebook targeting new parents, targeting pregnant women, because these are, discernible categories, telling them that vaccines caused SIDS. Not autism, but SIDS. And so again, when you have that capacity to target people for whom that information is profoundly salient, that's where you start to see these questions of what is the appropriate moderation response in that space. Network effects, people participate in social networks because their friends are there, and this is a sort of it's kind of a reinforcing dynamic. Engagement, people like and share things as much for social signaling as because of deep belief. A lot of the times one of the challenges we have is that our understanding of what is interesting to people is derived from what they engage with. These are really incomplete understandings of how people actually respond to provocations that are put in front of them. That you may like something because you like the share, and not necessarily because you like the information. You may like it because you're bookmarking it to come back to it. So a lot of our understanding of how social media influences conversations is derived based on things like engagement, but unfortunately, the curation algorithms are also deciding what to share based on engagement. So we have to think about this as a complex system in which different inputs and different ways in which the algorithms and the users intersect using the tools that they've been given creates a particular information environment. And then the final thing, of course, is gameable algorithms, which we still see today. There was a kind of funny dynamic that was happening on Twitter over the last 48 hours where there was a spam account called Shirts That Go Hard. And it was like really, kind of like snarky shirt slogans. And all of a sudden, a lot of people on Twitter are reporting seeing their feed being taken over. I see some people nodding, by Shirts That Go Hard. And Twitter had to figure out all of a sudden, like, how the hell were they gaming the recommendation engine, and why was this spam account suddenly everywhere in people's feeds? They figured it out, they changed it, they adjusted it. But this is the kind of dynamic where even today in 2022, gameable algorithms do create sort of unintended consequences in what is pushed into people's feeds and what they see. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's a lot less funny. Again, complex system, it's the entirety of the information ecosystem. We can't treat Twitter differently than Facebook, differently than YouTube, because even though they have different affordances and different things, different audiences, reasons people go there, content that is created on YouTube is shared to Twitter, shared to Facebook, and so we do think about the information environment holistically in the work that we try to do at SIO. So the power to influence opinions increasingly lies with those who can most widely and effectively disseminate a message. It is about influence, it is about reach. One of the things that people were saying today, how do you feel that the message is coming from the appropriate person? Marketers have a term for this: reach, resonance, and relevance. A lot of what is happening is that information is moving along ecosystems designed for viral advertising, ecosystems designed for particular marketing communications, and so thinking about things in those terms is actually at times useful. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we kind of covered it in some of the morning sessions, but trust is declining, confidence in institutions are declining, affective polarization is on the rise. There is a significant content glut. Again, as zero-cost publishing means that anyone can create anything, what is curated is how platforms respond to content glut. And then the battle for attention, is I think probably the last issue at hand here. People have less and less attention. They have a fixed amount of attention, and what they spend it on in this environment is something that a lot of social scientists are paying attention to right now. So the takeaway, though, of this environment is that as your opinions are shaped by engagement, by algorithms, by people you spend your time with, what we are seeing as particularly, public health institutions are not necessarily participating in the conversation in quite the same way as peers. The influence and expertise have been decoupled. People often are responding much more to things that they're seeing from peer groups, and hearing experts say, well, this is the truth of the matter, is not as persuasive, does not necessarily carry the resonance that it once did. So I'm going to walk through quickly some of the things. We put out this report, the Virality Project, I saw. Thank you for including it in some of the pre-reads. It is long, I know it is very, very long. At SIO, we try to produce white papers, and then we go through the peer review process, like chapter by chapter. But we believe that putting information out as quickly as possible, given the dynamics of the conversation in that time, is valuable to the public. So the Virality Project covered a variety of different things. I'm going to kind of walk through a couple of them here. But again, we could predict what narratives were going to emerge in the context of COVID by looking at what narratives had emerged in smallpox, in Ebola, in Zika, in MMR. There is nothing that is new about the specific content. It is inflected for the new disease, it is inflected for the new vaccine, but the kind of core building blocks, the tropes, really remain constant. And this is something that we're doing a lot of writing about, this notion of building blocks, narrative building blocks, as a potential area for trying to assess how perhaps best to respond to this. Safety narratives, the vaccine is dangerous. In the particular inflection with an mRNA vaccine, of course, is that it alters your DNA, but many of these other things, the vaccine contains toxic substances. I'm sure most of the people in this room remember thimerosal, right? And so all of the things that you see here, the VAERS database, again, this has been a topic of some kind of contention in how the public processes it, how anti-vaccine activists talk about it versus how the medical field understands it. Efficacy narratives, the vaccine doesn't work. Again, natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. Even in my limited 7 years of experience starting as an activist, and these were the same arguments that we were refuting in the conversation around SB 277, nothing was really new. Distribution narratives, this is where we get into why the vaccine exists, and in our work we kind of lump the liberty narrative into distribution because the mandate conversation is so core to this question of who gets it, when, why, and how. Again, mandates violate the Nuremberg Code. This argument has been made about school vaccines and anti-vaccine spaces for close to a decade now. Conspiracy narratives, we try to really limit our use of the word conspiracy theory to particular allegations that someone is behind this, that there is a person behind a curtain, there is a cabal, there is a group of people who are doing a thing to a community. And so we try to keep that terminology quite distinct. And so for this, you get it again, the lab leak hypothesis doesn't count as a conspiracy theory. There is some argument about its plausibility. The vaccine is a bioweapon. The lab leak was deliberate because the Chinese government wanted this in the world. That's where we get into the realm of conspiracy theory, and we try to differentiate a little bit on this because there's different ways to respond in terms of how communities process their information. We talk a little bit in the report about the dynamics of how this makes its way from kind of viral TikTok challenges that seem to start as a joke to amplification on other platforms, again by longstanding anti-vaccine activists like Del Bigtree, to sort of satire. It kind of started from people who were really talking about the magnet to actually a lot of attention going to the magnet challenge because people start to make fun of it. But then at the same time, you do have these arguments being presented before legislatures, before school boards, before public health institutions in various counties. And so we do start to see, what happens online doesn't stay online. It does influence the public conversation. In the report, we talk quite a bit about familiar characters and new additions. So again, these are folks who, if you have been part of the vaccine conversation for any extended period of time, you're aware of the ways in which different communities inflect the message about vaccines for their audience. So what a wellness influencer is going to put out is probably going to be much more around kind of narratives around purity, natural immunity being better, you not needing these things, versus what we start to see from right-leaning political influencers, which is highly, highly mandate-focused. And so the narratives are inflected in different ways for different communities, which means that the information is not evenly distributed, and so the counter-speech, the counter-action has to happen with an understanding of what narrative is playing in which community when, and then to have, again, as folks mentioned this morning, credible messengers to handle the counter-speech and the correction. There we go. One of the things that we talk about quite a bit in the report is platform policy. There are some real challenges when platforms try to figure out what to do with this stuff, and that's because a very large percentage of it takes the form of personal testimonials. And so there was a real, feeling that if you are taking down allegations about a vaccine experience, you are censoring a person's personal expression. And so again, as platforms try to think through what is the high harm dynamic here, how do you allow people to speak, allow them to share their experiences while at the same time differentiating between a personal testimonial versus an actual falsifiable misinformation claim in which the consensus has arrived at a conclusion about the safety of the vaccine overall. So this is an interesting tension and one that I think we'll talk about a little bit during the Q&A. But we do go through in all of the work that we do, we've done this for the election work too, just assessing what are the policies that platforms have in place, and then potentially more importantly, are they applied evenly? Because if one person's narrative comes down and another person's doesn't, this leads to a lot of dynamics around allegations of censorship, allegations of viewpoint-based discrimination, perpetuates a feeling of aggrievement, my voice is being silenced, leading to even more attention to that content potentially than it would have had it been left up. So I know many people think platforms just need to take down more. That is not actually how the dynamics play out as we observe them, as we observe the secondary conversation around vaccine narratives online. Again, I think I kind of just said this. The platforms are trying to maintain this distinction between what is factually inaccurate and what is a political argument. And this is where I think that notion of counter speech, that notion, as you've all been describing, how do you work in storytelling, how do you respond in a way that isn't reliant upon a platform taking something down? When should that platform intervention be used versus when should the counter speech, kind of networked counter speech be used, is one of the key questions I think that faces us in this particular topic going forward. So I think what we continue to see is rumors that fuel vaccine hesitancy remain a challenge. There, as folks have noted, some of the debates about it, even in just the last 24, 48 hours on Twitter, as hospitals try to put out corrections around the situation that happened with their doctors. There are very entrenched, really deep communities that are very good at both going on counterattack and continuing to propagate the information along. That was sort of the point of the network graph in the first chart. Public health is a little bit more in it now, but it is not really necessarily where it needs to be. So how can the medical community help? So I want to give a shout out to This Is Our Shot, and they reached out to us at SIO pretty early on when we announced that we were doing this project, that we were looking at vaccine hesitancy. I chose not to spend a lot of time on the ways in which our interinstitution efforts kind of come into play. This is a slide actually from This Is Our Shot in a presentation they did that I've cribbed here. But one of the questions that we were asked is, to enable that counter speech, to enable that counter content, what is it the physician should be doing? And so they reached out and they said, can you help us understand what narratives are going viral within which communities, so that we can understand how to do the counter speech, how to do the counter content. And so this is the kind of partnership that actually really does need to persist. I heard a shout out to Joe Smizer and PGP. They were also very much a part of this dynamic, building dashboards, helping people understand. It doesn't do any good to just put out generic conversations and to hope that you tweeting to your 1,000 followers is going to reach the public. That's just not how it works. Building those networks where many people are participating, many people are contributing content into hashtags, even contributing content into adversarial hashtags, trying to change the conversation, is something where I think there's a lot of opportunities to do pilots, where at SIO our work is primarily focused on detection and understanding. We build tools for detection and understanding. We are not counter speakers, we are not physicians, we are not the credible counter messengers, and so we don't put out corrections. What we try to do is use our work to inform those that are, whether again the topic is election officials trying to figure out why Sharpiegate is trending, or physicians trying to understand the latest weird COVID vaccine hashtag. So these are the kinds of partnerships that need to happen in order to create that networked counter movement, to create that visibility. The things we were trying to do with Vaccinate California as like 6 people really need to be, I think at this point, the recognition that the information environment is here to stay. The censorship and takedowns do not work, so there has to be a different response, and it has to be a networked response. This is some of the, I went into the This Is Our Shot hashtag just as I was pulling my deck together, and just pulled out some of the, some of the slides, some of the Instagram posts that I liked. And these are not even the highest engagement posts, but it shows a real depth of content creation, right? So you have the personal, the little girl with the Mickey Mouse ears, the possibly mom and baby down there. You have the sort of first-person testimonial. There's the person with the Band-Aid on her arm. So this is the very much, here is my personal lived experience of this vaccine, right? Which is the sort of counterweight to the here is my terrible experience kind of content. Then you have the useful statistics, the presentation of facts, and more importantly, you have things like the memes, right? That sort of, for those who are not familiar, that kind of superhero trying to decide which button to push is a very common meme template used for many, many, many different topics. You see it all the time. It creates a kind of, the off-ramp also. There's a really funny off-ramp happening right now with in the Dr. Oz Senate race, where Fetterman is arguing that Dr. Oz needs to take the turnpike off back to New Jersey. These are this is not a reflection of my personal political opinion on Fetterman or Oz, but that kind of thing speaks to an audience. They get it, they've seen it, it's familiar, it's funny, and they share it. And that is very, very different than here is my PDF with my statistics, right? Which is not going to get shared. So as much as it's important to have that out there for that contextualization, in some ways you bring people into the conversation through the off-ramp meme or the the superhero meme. And so having people who are content creators who are part of this process, who understand in-group relevance of social media signaling, which is what memes really are, units of cultural, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of cultural familiarities, the notion of like the genetics of narrative evolution is the kind of niche academic way of thinking about that, but it really resonates with the public, and that kind of thing is important. We also engage with folks like the Surgeon General. We were working with OSG through this project, again, trying to help government understand what is happening. There are a lot of challenges to how should the government respond to what is First Amendment protected freedom of expression, right? And so the government arguing that content needs to come down is not what we want to see. The government trying to say, here's the most reliable information that we have, and then communicating that not only to the platforms for labeling purposes, to folks like us to understand where that interplay is happening, but then also to folks like This Is Our Shot or other physicians to say, here is the most accurate information we have at this time, and trying to create those channels of communication across different stakeholders. So I'll end here just by saying that even as the COVID conversation continues in its evolution and changes, the established anti-vaccine networks and the political advocacy efforts, somebody earlier noted, and it is very, very true, right-wing political identity in particular has really adopted a very vaccine-hesitant stance, in part because of the mandates argument. The freedom narrative really resonates, but it is also being brought to bear on what should happen with school vaccines now. And so even very, very well-established, long-standing, demonstrably safe vaccines are being kind of recontextualized again as tools of state control. And so this is where the conversation is going. That headline at the top, The Anti-Vaccine Movement's New Frontier, is a really excellent New York Times article that begins to kind of document and chronicle what's happened. And I think that's where, again, the conversation is not going to end as COVID, whatever happens with COVID and the public perception of it. But the focus is now turning very much to routine childhood vaccines and state legislation.